Hi, my name's David Bose. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. And welcome to this episode of Washington Policy on the Go, where we'll be talking about the definition of property in all 50 states and how it relates to Washington's income tax battle going on in the courts right now. We'll talk with Jason Mercier about that. We'll also talk about the latest state action on trying to bring forward a universal health care, AKA a government-only healthcare system. We'll talk with Research Director Elizabeth Hovde about that, and also some of the governor's vaccine mandates and how they've evolved over the last couple of weeks. And we'll talk to her also about the long-term care tax, the payroll tax and program. And we'll get the latest update on the exemption figures and what's happening with that tax. We're going to start today with our initiative on Agriculture Director Pam Lewison about a lawsuit from the Attorney General's office and what it reveals about the lack of understanding among the Attorney General staff regarding the H-2A worker program. We'll talk with her about that in just a moment. First, I want to remind you, we adopted a new platform, a new way of doing things, a new format for the show a few weeks back, where what we do now, instead of waiting for the end for Q&A, we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A tool in Zoom. Should be at the bottom of your screen, could be on the side, depending on how you have it formatted. Put your questions there at any time, and then we'll incorporate them into the conversation as we go. So that way, before I let Pam go, for example, your questions about the H-2A worker program and the Attorney General's lawsuit, those will be asked and answered, and then we'll move on to the next topic. We'll have a sharp cutoff at 1 o'clock. We won't go more than 60 seconds over, and that would only be because if I see the clock, and I'm glancing at it, I'm going to try and land us as close to 1 o'clock as possible or before. So we will not go over. We're respecting your lunch hour, and we'll make sure that we keep that in order. I'm giving people a little bit of time here to catch on and sign in to our Zoom event. That's why we do this intro every time. So for those of you who are regulars to this program, just bear with us. And some of this is going to be old hat for you. But again, you can use the chat function for questions, but it's a little harder for me as a moderator to check through the chat than it is the Q&A function, and I can mark those questions. So if you'd use the Q&A for all questions, that would be more helpful. So I appreciate that. With that, I'm going to bring Pam Lewison, our initiative on Agriculture Director, on to talk about the lawsuit from the Attorney General's office regarding the H-2A program. Pam, you don't look like a farmer today. You look like a television broadcaster, but I should say that's one of your new roles, correspondent with some Ag TV, which is exciting, coming up, and we'll be sharing those on WashingtonPolicy.org media, I'm sure. Why don't you start, Pam, by just going through what it was that the Attorney General is suing over, without showing what he's doing wrong. Just give us a synopsis of what the Attorney General's office is up to and which farmers might be impacted by it.
So it's really specific to a mushroom grower in the Toppenish area. And there's some labor violations that may or may not have occurred. The grower in particular is accused of violating some labor law specific to things like favoring male workers over female workers and sort of inventing reasons to fire some employees so that they can then seek out H-2A employees. And those sorts of things are, obviously a violation of, both state and federal labor law. So the problem with it is that they've taken these things that are real violations and then turn them into an indictment of the H-2A program as a whole. And that's where things get a little bit tricky.
And how is that? Give us an example of how this becomes a problem if they're condemning one farmer who may or may not have violated some rules. How are they kind of twisting it in order to create an issue with the entire H-2A program?
So H-2A is something that a lot of farmers in Washington rely on. In fact, this year we had roughly 29,000 H-2A visas approved in Washington state, which is up above our average by about 4,000 positions, give or take. And H-2A is a program that allows foreign workers to come to Washington State with a legal work visa so that they don't have to be in fear of deportation while they are working on farm. And it gives them up to 10 months to earn a what is really a generous wage to work on farms where they are contracted to work specifically in an assigned task area. And some of the things in that lawsuit particularly allege that the grower was firing domestic workers to hire H-2A workers, which is something you can't do legally. And they also talk about things like that H-2A workers have less rights than local workers, which is also just not the case. Specifically, when you talk about things like what's fair and what's right, H-2A workers have very similar rights to US workers, if not identical. They're very, very closely aligned. And then it also talks about things like how this grower in particular wanted to hire H-2A workers because then their employees are trapped, quote unquote trapped. They have to stay with that employer. And there is some truth to that, but it's not trapped in the sense of like indentured servitude. You are contracted to work with a specific employer and you can't seek out employment elsewhere unless you end your contract with your employer. And then you have to go home and you start your visa process over again.
Well, let's walk through why that would be, because I just put in, for those of you unfamiliar with the H-2A program, we created an animated explainer video on it, and I put the link in to your chat function there so you can check it out at any time. But why don't you just describe what it is that farmers do to prepare to bring in the H-2A workers, so that we have the better understanding of why someone has to fulfill that contract before they go somewhere else, or they obviously they could go home if they wanted to, but why would that be?
So the H-2A program, first and foremost on the employer side, is extraordinarily expensive and time consuming. So you have to identify the number of workers that you need by first advertising for a minimum of 60 days locally. And at that 60-day mark, if you don't have enough qualified employees from a local pool, then you can contact the federal government and say, this is the gap in employees that I have identified. The federal government then says, okay, now you can apply for X number of visas to fill that gap. When you have that gap identified and certified by the federal government, then you go through the process of applying for filling that gap. And to be clear, every single application, one application per person, costs an average of about $1,500. That's just the paperwork. In addition to that, you also have to prepare housing, travel, and food while your employees are traveling, and any other needs that they may have during their to and from to get to your farm. In addition to that, you are responsible for their travel while they are here in the US and working for you, as well as providing them with housing and a minimum wage that's called the adverse effect wage rate. Now, what that does is set an artificial minimum wage that is over and above what we pay as a minimum wage in Washington State. So Washington State's minimum wage this year is, I believe, $14.41, unless you live in one of the areas where it's higher than that. This year's adverse effect wage rate is $3 higher than that. It's $17.31, I believe, or $17.41. So you have this greater bar for wages that you must pay to those H-2A workers while they are on site as well. And if you have a single H-2A worker on your farm, any local worker who is doing the same job is required to be paid the same wage, whether they are local or an H-2A worker.
I was about to say, so, when a farmer, embarks on this project, there's a significant outlay, as you put it, $1,500 in paperwork alone. That's not including the other expenses that you were talking about, just to get the worker here. And then when they're here, the minimum wage is higher than the state minimum wage. And then if they were paying anyone else a minimum wage for that job, that wage would also have to go up for all workers there. So, there's a very big outlay here. So now that we know all this, where does the Attorney General go wrong in how they're describing the H-2A program in, I think it was their press release regarding this other specific incident?
Right.
Because it should have been about a specific farmer, but instead there seems to be a kind of a more blanket approach toward a condemnation of a broader scope of industry. Let me put it that way.
So I think really specifically in that outlining of rights being different between local and foreign workers is the first place. And then I think talking about how those workers are trapped. And then and also talking about the disparity in wages. I mean, those three areas alone show an inherent misunderstanding of how H-2A functions. And I think more than that, a bias about how we talk about H-2A workers versus local employees. And I think it's something that's been systemic. We've talked about it a lot, and I have written about it a lot in terms of trying to get people to understand that H-2A is not a bad thing. If anything, it's a good thing because it ensures that foreign-born workers have a legal means to work. They are not afraid of things like being deported, and they have a wage that is guaranteed to them. So something that a lot of people don't know about the H-2A program as well is there are, in most instances, if your contract ends early, the harvest ends early, or there's something outside of the control of the farm worker themselves, they are guaranteed 3/4 of their contracted wages, and they get to go home early. So their employer is required to pay them even if they aren't working, that for the entire duration of their contract.
So when you see the Attorney General's office say something like these H-2A workers are, they don't have they have fewer rights than U.S. based workers, what's your response to that?
I think it's not understanding how this program functions holistically. So is it true that an H-2A worker can't one day up and say, I'm going to go work for this guy, I'll be back tomorrow? Absolutely, that is true. But what they can do is say, I would like to end my contract so that I can explore other employment opportunities. They have absolutely every right to do that. There is nothing that prevents an H-2A worker from leaving their place of employment, but with the understanding that they are ending their contract, which means they have to go home because they've ended their visa by indicating that they want to end their contract.
And there's various other professions and things that people do where they're receiving certain training, or, non-competes sometimes go out of bounds and get a little crazy, but there are places where there's specific training expenses going in, and various professions where people have to wait a certain period of time, or they have to do something before they go back into the same industry or field to encourage the investment in personnel like that. Here's a quick question from Mary Dye. She writes, the Goodlatte Immigration Reform Act passed from the House to the Senate in 2017 and did not progress. Congressman Dan Newhouse recently introduced his reform of the H-2A bill. First, is there any chance of this bill moving via the Appropriations Committee to the Senate and then be incorporated into the budget? And secondly, is the Goodlatte reforms of H-2A and H-1B dead on arrival in the Senate? Now, I don't know, this is a federal question, so you might not know, but do you have any comments or any light to shed on that?
So I have been following it loosely. I am hopeful that it will move forward, but with the way things are federally, you just don't know, to be blunt. And so I think there are lots of ways that the H-2A program could be improved. And I think that Congressman Newhouse's bill is an excellent start. I wrote in support of his initial attempt at trying to improve the H-2A program. Certainly, there were some challenges to it and parts of it that required compromise to have it be bipartisan. I think that's the case again. But whether it's going to move forward or not, I don't have a crystal ball, so I couldn't say for certain.
Do you prescribe, some of the issues you brought up with the Attorney General's office? It strikes me that this is exactly the kind of I don't want to use the word ignorance is a bit loaded, and I don't mean it I mean it in a descriptive way, not necessarily an insulting way in this particular instance, because there's people don't know what they don't know, and there's a lot of people involved in policymaking and in this case law enforcement and other kinds of enforcement where they're just not familiar with the farming world. They haven't been in it. So do you prescribe it more to an ignorance of what the program's about, or do you see this as more an ideological bias in what you were looking at?
I think it depends on the audience. And the H-2A program is needlessly complicated. I mean, so there's a lot.
Something in government is needlessly complicated. Whoa.
There's a lot of things about it that could be streamlined and made much easier and a lot more sort of user friendly. And so that is part of the problem. I had to learn about it because it's my job. But I think if you're a casual observer, it seems like it favors foreign-born workers until you really truly understand what is involved in participating in the program and also what benefit it provides local workers just as an ancillary benefit in wage alone.
Well, Pam Lewison, a director of the Washington Policy Center Initiative on Agriculture, thanks for spending some time with us today on the H-2A program and the Attorney General's lawsuit. You can find her blog posting on that at washingtonpolicy.org. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, Dave.
All right, let's turn to Elizabeth Hovde. She is our director for our Center for Healthcare. She joins us now. If I remember correctly, Elizabeth, there was some H-2A talk in your sphere as well regarding the Long-Term Care Act. Why don't you outline that for us just to begin with?
Great. Yeah, it was, I heard Pam talking and I thought, oh, we should hit this really quick. The legislature approved 4 different groups to be exempted, as they call it, from the long-term care law that's coming at us in July of 2023. 58 cents per $100 will be taken out of workers' paychecks, and that includes people like H-2A workers, temporary workers in our state, and people who live out of state but work here. So these groups that were told from the outset of the long-term care law that they will not benefit ever from the Washington Cares Fund were given exemptions. And while the intention looks good, I'm not sure it's a real exemption. These people are going to have to apply individually for exemption and show it to their employer. Some of these temporary workers are here 6 weeks. Some of them don't have English language skills. I don't know how this is going to work. I think an exemption should be an exemption. And if they want, they can opt in, but to automatically have them in it and they have to opt out. Right now, the rulemaking is progress, and I'm hoping to influence that rulemaking to help people who will not, for sure, will not benefit. There are only some of the people who won't benefit. Those of us who don't need long-term care won't benefit from this program that's being billed as something that's helpful to everyone, to all workers. There's a lot of reasons. That's the pattern with this law. There are barriers erected all over the place on this law to keep you from ever realizing a benefit from 10 plus years of payroll taxes that you put in. And this is another one of them.
Yeah, the optics on this, politically speaking, would be bad. If you're taking, money from what is it? How many cents per 100? 58 cents, isn't it?
58 cents per 100. Yeah.
58 cents per 100.
Right now, it might go up.
Yeah, and And by the way, if they want to stay in the black, so to speak, it will go up because they, it's already bankrupt before it's even started. So it's 58 cents now, just because we're going to keep the number lower to make it less horrifying to the voters that will have to pay for it. But it's 58 cents, and then you're talking about these H-2A workers who are coming here, and as you point out, they're, as Pam just pointed out, they're spending the farmer's spending $1,500 in paperwork to get them there. They've had to go through all this paperwork at home. These are people that are working extremely hard all over the globe to send money back to their families. It's hard to find time and get into a nuance of an opt-out and what paperwork you're going to need from Washington, who's going to walk through that with them there, to get them to opt out.
Yeah.
So it's a way for the state to take their money, while also being able to say, well, it's not our fault. We gave them an option and they didn't take it.
And it's interesting in the language about this, the legislation that was passed, you will not be reimbursed until you've applied, been accepted your application, and told your employer. So even if they do it all, and the state determines when they're accepted and when they can tell their employer, and so they won't get that money back. And I just think it's really unlikely in a 6-week job kind of thing that this is going to happen. But I hope to influence the rulemaking to see it come out more favorably.
Yeah, and how long does it take the state to determine if they're accepted or not? I mean, that's another question, because there was a pretty big backlog on people who were opting out at the beginning with what was it? What did it end up? Over 500,000 people?
It's just under 500,000 right now. And the Employment Security Department did do really well at processing those fairly quickly. Not the first day, it shut down the website. But in time for the law to take force, they got almost all of it done. And then, of course, they kicked the can down the road, and it's not happening until summer. But the point with that is they didn't require much. It was an attestation. I'm under the understanding that these new exemption categories are going to have to prove their exemption status and documentation. So I think it's going to take longer. But again, that's me looking at the process from here. And I hope rulemaking works out in these people's favors.
Yeah, there's a quick way to streamline that, which is just
Just
repeal the program. Just repeal the program.
And my understanding
from
my understanding of people who work with H-2A workers is they're already automatically exempt from UI, from unemployment insurance. So there's already a model here. There's already something we could put in place. And I hope to see that happen.
Yeah, one would hope. Speaking of mandates and things that have upset a lot of people, you wrote recently about the vaccine mandate impacting workers and state services. How has that changed since the last time we talked? I know the governor's made some changes to the booster mandates, and I'm wondering, when I saw some of the changes and I saw new guidelines from the CDC, I wondered, how many careers that were destroyed will have those careers back and reinstated, with no penalty, so to speak. And I'm wondering if you could address, kind of what's been going on in that category.
My mind is boggled why the governor didn't take this get out of jail free card. The CDC has chosen not to differentiate anymore based on vaccination status in their policies because of where COVID is at and vaccinations and people who have contracted and recovered. So it was an opportunity for him to say, all right, we've been following the CDC guidance and science, and we're going to drop this mandate. Now it's an appropriate time to do so and allow our state service levels to come back. We read something every day about Washington State ferries or fire departments or police where our service levels are suffering right now. So this was a chance to be able to have a reason for dropping the mandate that wasn't just him on his own. He could have used the CDC as cover to do this, but he did not. And my mind is boggled why you would continue this mandate. It's either just a really firm belief that he has, or it's an attempt to avoid litigation, although his directive making it a permanent requirement, I don't think lets him necessarily escape litigation attempts, but
Yeah, it also goes against what he was saying earlier, which is we're going to follow what the CDC says.
Right.
We're going to follow what health officials say. And then suddenly it's like, well, we're going to follow them to a point, but if it interferes with my own ideological agenda, or there seems to be, and this is my personal experience, not with the governor, but with other individuals, and I'm triple jabbed, just not that it's anybody's business, but I am. And I had COVID. It was a miserable experience for myself. But I've known others who got through it fine, who had, no jabs at all, and others who suffered mightily, with vaccinations. But I view it as your own individual choice thing, particularly since we know that just because you're jabbed doesn't mean you can't spread, the disease. So the CDC puts out this guideline, the governor does it. But one thing I've noted is that there are people that they got the jab and they're so angry at those who didn't. It's almost like they're angry about the whole disease, the shutdown. They don't know where to place that frustration, and so they're placing it on their neighbors and friends and family members who didn't get it, as though somehow it's their fault. And so there's a desire to punish people who haven't done what they wanted them to do to begin with. And I don't know if that's out of fear or what, but I have noted that, and this, you could apply this on both sides, I guess, to a certain degree, but on the mandate issue, it's mainly the one where there's people that are angry and they want to punish people in any way that they can who didn't do what they wanted them to do, which is kind of a weird phenomenon.
Yeah.
And maybe the governor's in that category.
I put the shoulders on the government for most of this. We were told over and over and over again, without any data supporting it, that we would be cured if everyone all got jabbed. If everyone got the shots, this would go away. We were told this, we were told to believe it. The second we found out that wasn't happening, that you can contract or spread COVID, that was the time to say, oh, we need to reassess the situation. This is not the situation, a different message sending campaign. But various leaders have been intent on separating the public into camps over this and making it a political thing.
And also risk assessment and fear assessment has been poor, because when we talk about, risk of death or serious health complications and other things, media wise, and I think in some ways government has done a poor job just outlining, where those risks are heaviest and what they actually are. I've seen some decent polling of left and right on this, showing that, people on the left tend to view, a COVID diagnosis as, I want to say it was like 30, they think there's like a 30 to 40% hospitalization rate, and that's nowhere near what's accurate.
Nowhere near it.
But you can imagine if you believed that, why it is you'd be so frustrated and thinking that hospitalization
Right.
is significantly likely to lead you to death. You can imagine why there's that anger and fear,
Right.
and why that grows so strong, that's sad in itself. And I think that's an untalked about public health failure.
Yeah.
Right
And I'm
now.
anxious for this to become a patient-centered health decision. People need to make this risk assessment. The CDC is agreeing it's time for that, given where we're at in COVID. And interestingly enough, the governor doubled down on his vaccine mandate, or tripled down or quadrupled down. I don't know how you want to put it. In late July, I believe, he sent out a directive saying that you also, as a state employee, had to have a booster. In addition, had to have the latest that was recommended for your age group or your situation to maintain state employment. And that has recently been said to be in union negotiation. It will no longer be required. There will be incentives for people who do get boosted, and he's encouraging boosters. But at the same time, that doesn't seem based on science at all. You've got these numbers coming out of King County, which are really informative and show us the outcomes of COVID based on vaccination status. And right now you've got boosted people testing positive for COVID at higher rates than people who just got the initial vaccination series. So it's interesting, if you're going to make a booster mandate, there ought to be a demonstrable health benefit. And we're not seeing it for either the booster, especially the booster, or across the board for a vaccination. You know, vaccines have been shown to be helpful for people who contract COVID to lessen their hospitalization and disease, death, which is already very low. But the vaccine mandate isn't saving us. It's not helping us. It's hurting our communities. It's tearing families and coworkers apart. It's just out of control.
Well, we saw during the winter with the snow plow drivers, big problems with the state. You know, the ferry system has its own issues. I don't know how much of it's COVID related, but I suspect that when there's a significant personnel change, and you're saying that we're having problems with personnel issues, that there's at least some correlation there. And so you're right, there was this get out of jail free card, but there's also you know, a strong incentive politically, because a lot of mandates and a lot of what the governor does is very popular among a broad category of people. And I know, you know, some people hate to hear it because they're not fans of it, but I'm just saying, poll wise, you look at the spectrum of people that generally approve, and they're just kind of taking their cue from that. And in part because what I was talking about earlier, there's a great deal of fear and concern for themselves, their families, for other people they know who have immunodeficiencies and other things that are all understandable. But if you know, so if you keep this kind of thing up, then the conversation like we're having is still about various mandates and other things. Even if the science says something else, you know, you can always say, well, I'm being overcautious, which, you know, if people are afraid, that's not a bad position to have. That's kind of a sympathetic position to have. You know, bad as in for your popularity. So it keeps the conversation there instead of, say, you know, gas prices are going to go up 46 cents a gallon next year because of this emissions tax. And, you know, virtually no one's talking about that except for Washington Policy Center and
I was going to say, I think that's one of my greatest irritations, that we've just not been given the full information. You know, we're learning the information. It was changing constantly. No one faults governments or medical experts for not giving information they didn't know at the time. But even when we found out more information about how vaccinations and COVID were impacting us, we weren't given full information. Even now, I can't find good numbers like King County has regarding outcome by vaccination status. And I think the reason they're not there on the state level is because they don't want us talking about it. The fact that boosted people are contracting and testing positive, you know, it's not a popular thing they want to have publicized.
Here's a question from Idri. The bigger question, this is about long-term care costs, even for those who believe they will never need it until they do, which for many, they will not have access to funding and instead will have to dip into any savings they have. Respond to this beyond what was said today on those who are part-time employees and or Oregonians. So I mean, I'm not real clear, other than I think what the question is about is, you know, so what do you do if they don't have this benefit? You know, how are they going to pay for the long-term care needs? Because, you know, there's a lot of people who will need them. What should we be doing about them?
Yeah, the need is real. There is no disagreement. We're finding, research finds that 7 out of 10 people will probably need long-term care. I can't remember by what year, but we're living longer. More of us are going to require it. More of us are going to need it or want it. And this is legit. However, it is not the state's job to create a savings account for each one of us that we're mandated to pay into for only one life need. There are all sorts of life needs, and we have savings, we have investments, we make preparation in various ways for these things. And that is my hope of the government, to start encouraging talk about this long-term care need as it comes along, strengthen the safety net. If they stop letting the Medicaid dollars be given to people who don't qualify or don't qualify, we could be preserving a safety net. Instead, we're making the safety net as wide as the state and trying to convince people that they have peace of mind that this is a covered activity by the state because they've created a mandatory savings account. But the thing is, we can all save in different ways. We can strengthen our safety nets and prepare for this without depending on the government.
So another quick question for you on the long-term care issue is, have you noted any growing movement toward repeal? Because that's a subject that's come up a number of times and a number of people have asked about it. I know that there have been some lawmakers that have suggested repeal. Do you see any hint of a bipartisan, movement in that regard based on the number of people opting out and trying to opt out? Or do you see this still as kind of a static issue that we're really focused on probably paying starting next year?
I don't see any progress yet. Of course, we're not in the legislative session yet where you'd be able to see more of it. But no, I have not had outreach from any more of the lawmakers than I had last year, or have seen any proposed talk about it. And another thing I think that we need to grapple with is we at least need to change the messaging about this thing. The state keeps telling you you have peace of mind if we have WA Cares. WA Cares, you have to pay into 10 or more years. And if you do so, and if you health qualify someday, you will get $36,500 to pay for long-term care. And it's not an adequate amount for most people with long-term care needs. So telling people they can have peace of mind, I think, is just worsening the problem. You're going to have more people not planning and investing or saving for long-term care, one of life's many, many needs. And we're just making the hole bigger. We're, and a person who goes through the 36,500 in 3 months or something and doesn't have resources to care for themselves is going to be on Medicaid anyway. So it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see, I haven't seen more people coming out against it, but we'll see when the legislative session starts if there's more lawmakers. Right now, what I saw last session is the Democrats really bonding together in being united on the issue that we were going to have a mandated long-term care program in Washington State.
Well, there's a number of reasons for that we could get into, but we probably won't have time. We have a number of questions that just popped up about long-term care, which we'll get to in just a moment. Okay. But very quickly, I wanted to ask you one question about, I know you've been following the Washington State's Universal Healthcare Committee. That's the Universal Healthcare Commission is basically meeting over and over again, trying to find a way to get Washington
for decades.
To get a government-run healthcare system. Did anything happen at this meeting that struck you as something you need to tell people about, or where do you see that movement headed, and how soon do you expect any legislative action on that front?
I think the two big things I'm seeing in those meetings that are concerning is talk about getting more people now under the government healthcare safety net in whatever way they can to help show that we can do this. So there is a goal to create more government dependency, and government dependency is not good for many reasons, right? It means you're on a limited income. It means you're a low income person, first and foremost. And we don't want people to stay in low incomes. We want people to thrive in their lives and make more money and make a better life for themselves. But getting more people under the tent is concerning, and that's going on at the federal level too. The Inflation Reduction Act was just passed, and it extends the Affordable Care Act subsidies for people who don't qualify for Medicaid for 3 more years. So you've created a long-term entitlement for people who may not need it. These are people who have gotten work back after COVID, have access to healthcare through employers, have other ways to pay for healthcare than being reliant on Medicaid. So the state has a real opportunity here to clean up its Medicaid rolls and really preserve money for people in need. We all want that. But instead, there's this agenda, it seems to me, to get more people on our Medicaid rolls. There's a current waiver out from our state to the federal government that we can provide health care for immigrants without status. So, this desire to increase the amount of people on government dependent healthcare is the biggest thing I'm seeing there. And the other thing is the failure to acknowledge, I think they might be able to make a case at some point for a cost savings and the overall money that goes into healthcare with all our premiums and insurance and government, et cetera, and a new universal care system. But there's no acknowledgement that you don't get this fantasy trifecta of lower cost, increased access, and increased quality.
Yeah.
There's no discussion about it. And I think we just really need to be realistic that this doesn't happen like that. And it doesn't happen elsewhere like that.
Yeah, it's funny. There's been a number of states. We're not talking Texas or even Florida. We're talking about very, very left-leaning states that have done this. They've looked at it. They've had the same kind of commissions. They've gone farther. They've actually passed the legislation, and then they actually had to go and pass along information as to how much it was going to cost in taxes and how they would have to control healthcare costs by reducing access and basically rationing care. And the people turned against it overwhelmingly, and those were in very left-leaning states. So I view a lot of this as a refusal to learn from others.
Yeah.
We've got to get to Jason's big exploration of all 50 states. So I'm going to do a rapid fire question for you, less than 20 seconds on each question here, just to make sure they're answered. One, from Anonymous: if the state wants to establish an optional state savings account, that'd be fine. People could use it for long-term care. What do you think about that?
I don't think the government has any business in being a bank. I think for
you get poor returns, right?
I think that people can choose. That's their option, to save or invest in whatever way they see fit.
They could stop taking the money from the health savings account when I set it aside, and then they said spend it or lose it. So I'm buying, a bunch of acetaminophen that I don't need at the end of the year, to make sure I don't lose it. Allowing those things to roll over all the time would be a plus. Long-term care, this is from Idri. Long-term care averages $10,000 a month. Most facilities don't accept Medicare or Medicaid. Yes, it's good to dip in savings, but a good portion of people don't have the kind of savings needed for this expense. Thoughts? I think you said the same thing. Actually, it's expensive.
It's something we need to prepare for. It's expensive, and I think if you open up the private sector to come up with more solutions, it will. Instead, we're mandating long-term care. We're shutting down long-term care insurers, or making them hesitant to cover people. I think if more people knew about long-term care insurance, for some people, that is a great option. For others, it's not. They can invest in other ways and get a bigger return on investment.
Yeah, I think we recommend cutting the tax on insurance plans for that. There's you pointed out last time that the benefits for most of these private, or many of these private plans, kick in after 2 activities that you can't accomplish on your own if you're older life activities, versus the state, which is 3. There's lots of benefits there. So next question: will Medicaid cover the portion of long-term care services that are not covered by the $35,000?
Yeah, after you're off your $36,500 allotment, you can apply for Medicaid just like you can right now if you don't have assets that can carry you through long-term care. So that isn't changing.
A follow-up question, but this time from another viewer: is the minimal $36,500 benefit adjusted for healthcare inflation?
Yes. And back on that last question, another thing about, what was the last question?
Well, let me go back into the answered questions. That one was, let's see, it was, will Medicaid cover the portion of long-term care services not covered by the $36,500?
I don't think that was the one. Sorry.
Well, that was the one at 12:30.
I think I was yes, that is the one.
It is.
One of my big concerns has been that low-income workers are going to be taxed just like high-income workers, 58 cents per $100. This is a very regressive tax. So someone who would be on Medicaid because they're low income and has no assets has now been required to pay 58 cents per 100 that they could have used today on budgets, family budgets that they need to pay for groceries, etc. So this is something that is not helping low-income workers in the way that Law Cares is making it sound to be.
All right, last question for you, then we're turning to Jason on his 50-state exploration of property definitions. This is from Tom Osborne. Right now, for those on the Medicaid long-term care, it says weighted program. The personal needs allowance, the amount of income a person can keep before they were required to chip in towards the cost of care, is about $2,300, and they can't have more than, says $2,009 in resources. Will the Washington Cares program have these same limits? People type in a hurry, and I think there's some mistakes made.
No, so you
could be
will
me.
get, if you've invested 10 years or more and you health qualify with 3 or more ADLs, you will receive 36.5 regardless of your income or assets.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Appreciate you coming on today.
you.
I know it's always difficult to interrupt the schedule that way, but I appreciate the updates on a wide variety of categories there.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
All right, let's turn to Jason Mercier. He is, well, I always want to say you're our Center for Government Reform Director here at Washington Policy Center, but really it's Washington State's budget guru. Jason Mercier joins us now, and he's becoming, I think we should have called Guinness, because I'm not sure there's very many other people that can say that they've read the constitutions of all 50 states. Jason, tell us why you embarked on this thankless task.
Yeah, I feel like, how you get a sticker for saying you voted. I want a sticker for saying I've read all 50 state constitutions. Yeah, so it's the reason we started this, and this always has to come back to our favorite topic, an income tax, and the endless effort to bring one to Washington, despite the fact that voters have repeatedly said no thank you. And there is currently litigation before the state Supreme Court on the capital gains income tax. And that case will probably have oral arguments most likely in January or February of next year. And one of the briefs that was filed in that case was from the Washington Education Association. And the WA is making it a little bit of a different argument than the state attorney general. The attorney general's still trying to play this game that a income tax is not really an income tax, it's an excise tax, despite the fact that the IRS and everybody else in the world disagrees. But he's at least trying to play that game. The Washington Education Association is just saying, you know what, let's forget all of this. Let's just get to what we really want, and that is to be able to impose a broad-based income tax without a constitutional amendment. The voters aren't cooperating, so state Supreme Court, we want you to say that Washingtonians don't own their income so that we can do this. And the reason they're trying to make this argument is for nearly 100 years, the state Supreme Court has made this very reasonable determination that we own our income. And if we own our income, it is property. And this is what got me on the 50 state reviews, so I could say unequivocally how much stronger Washington's protection of property is in the Constitution versus other states.
And that's in part because Washington, when in the part of our Constitution talking about how to tax property, it's property that's tangible and intangible. Anything where there's ownership, and so the intangible becomes the income, even though you could argue I can pick up some cash and a check and it's tangible that way. But it's a novel argument that the WEA would be arguing that they don't own it, because I'm not sure I've ever heard that in union negotiations for teachers, that they don't own their salaries. It's how is it if we don't own it, who does? How does that work, Jason?
So we have a little bit of a sight into their thinking here. If you think back to the Seattle income tax case, because in that, again, same issues. And in fact, it's not in the Constitution, but in statute, intangible property is defined to include money. So the city of Seattle was arguing, well, income isn't money. Income is in transit. It hasn't yet been received, was the argument that they tried to make. Despite all of that, if we go back to the base issue, when you look at our Constitution and you look at the other 49 state constitutions, what you'll see in all of them is how you tax either real, personal, tangible, or intangible property, right? How do you tax it? But what you don't see in most constitutions is a definition of those terms. And that's where you go back to Washington's. And this is where, to me, this is a really simple case for our state Supreme Court to make, because they don't have to look at other court rulings across the country. They don't have to look at other constitutions. All they have to look at is the plain language in our Constitution, which, oh, by the way, our definition of property was added by the voters. 61% of voters adopted a constitutional amendment in 1930 to define property as everything subject to ownership. Everything. And that's why this case just simply comes down to, do you own your income? And that's really all the Supreme Court is being asked to rule on.
And as you point out, the voters passed this constitutional amendment, and they also said no to proposals to amend this constitutional amendment.
Yeah, so
go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, and the courts, as you've pointed out, Jason, you're the one that I'm getting all this from. The courts have also said that if someone wants to amend, change that definition or change how this is written, then the constitutional amendment process is open to them. So the people have said no multiple times to changing it. They said, yeah, they're the ones who created the amendment, and the courts have upheld that amendment over the past several decades.
And I think that's the most disingenuous and frustrating thing about this entire debate we've been having, at least for the 20 years that I've been in the state of Washington. If you want to graduate an income tax, that's an economic policy argument. You make the case and you follow the process to impose it. And in Washington, that requires a constitutional amendment, because you had that definition of property adopted by 61% of voters in 1930. And since then, you've had the voters reject 6 constitutional amendments to change that definition. The last time you rejected it in 1973, 77% of Washingtonians said no. It's not unequivocal as far as where the position of the state is, right? And because of these, the state Supreme Court has repeatedly told the legislature, stop playing games. Excise taxes aren't income taxes. If you want to impose a graduated income tax, you have to amend the Constitution. So where we are today really is unlike other states. Other states actually have adopted constitutional amendments to impose an income tax, right? 1976, New Jersey. I think Illinois was in the 70s. So it can be done, but there's a process. You just can't say, we can't get our electorate to cooperate, so let's see if we can get 5 of 9 Supreme Court justices to say Washingtonians don't own their income. That's not how you make tax policy.
The case is so absurd. I'm not an attorney, but I look at something like this and I think this has been decided so many times. It's so clear. It's clear in the language to a layperson. It's clear from the amendment that the voters inserted into the Constitution. It's clear from the votes we've had since. Even the non-constitutional votes, but just the initiatives that tried to implement an income tax even for high earners, which would have been challenged in court anyway. But even those were shot down by the voters more recently. So when I see all that, I feel like at the end of this, the state owes the challengers the legal fees for having to suffer through this again and again. In your Herculean task of reading all these constitutions, Jason, that's dry material, no doubt. Which one was the toughest to get through, and was there any that you went through? I know this has nothing to do with the state income tax issue, but I just am curious, which one was the toughest to get through and why? And then was there any time when you were reading it and think, you know what, Washington needs something like this, also?
So roll tide. Alabama's constitutional PDF was 563 pages. Now, that's not because they have that much in their constitution. It annotated all of the changes to their constitutions as it was adopted. So that was a bit to get through. California's was kind of interesting because the first half of California's was talking about how to deal with property that used to be Mexican property from when they had that war and seceded from Mexico and then got their independence. So that was kind of interesting to see all of this. Well, this is how you treat Mexican property, how you treat California property. Several states were so afraid of certain things, they go so far as to make sure you can't have polygamous marriages, which is kind of interesting to see. You had some of the southern states go out of their way to say wives actually own income. It's not all the husbands. That was kind of fun. But to your question of what do other states have that we clearly should, several states had in their constitutions supermajority for tax increase requirements or voter approval. And this will sound familiar because this is something that we passed the ballot 6 or 7 times, but our state Supreme Court ultimately said would require a constitutional amendment. And I think we should take advantage of that, seeing how it's in other state constitutions.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, very fine work, Jason, and I love how it relates. The amount of effort that you put forward in this, and the relation to the current state battle on income taxes is just it's fascinating to me. And once again, you keep thinking of new ways to approach this problem. I don't know if you're inspired by other. Do you get these ideas from the advocates of income taxes, or or just sitting around plotting your next trip to Disneyland and suddenly this pops into your mind like, what I've never looked into? Here's finally one more angle I haven't looked into.
Well, I'm old school. I don't expect my policies to all be implemented, but I do expect to be guaranteed a Republican form of government with checks and balances, and you follow the right way to implement policy. So that's kind of how I approach things, and it's easy to prove the case when you can see the comparison with other states.
Did you know we're still in an emergency? We've got 900 and some odd days of emergency power still, and the legislators and leadership still seem to have very little interest in reasserting their own legislative prerogatives, which is that's probably the most bizarre thing about that. And I'm sure you and I agree on that, which is I expected, I know I'm skipping here, but since you said, the form of government, I expected the legislative branch, regardless of party, to be more interested in their own authority and spheres of influence, because there used to be it's like at the federal level, if the House and the Senate take there's a certain amount of pride and authority that comes from either position, and they are zealous to protect that, or if you point it out to them, they are or should be. At the state level, we seem to have there's just a complete surrender to this idea that there can be a perpetual emergency, 900 days after the COVID pandemic, and then it can just go on forever. I mean, it's a bizarre situation, I think.
I'm interested to see what happens here at the federal level with the president's declaration on student loans, because you did have Speaker Pelosi say,
Great point.
This is a congressional act, right? This isn't something the president can do. And the president used emergency powers related to the 9/11 terrorist attack that was supposed to address the educational costs of people in the National Guard and being deployed. That's the rationale for having done this without an act of Congress. So I'm going to be interested to see if Congress, to your point about caring about its role as an appropriator, decides to file a lawsuit on this.
This strikes me as then a very large case of stolen valor, where they're abusing this law in order to create a benefit that doesn't exist and a power that doesn't exist. Jason, just tremendous work on this income tax thing. We've got a policy brief coming out shortly that'll outline this. Your blog is posted on it already, but if so you can read up at washingtonpolicy.org, or you can wait for the more official white paper document coming out soon. But it's great background for people that are watching this income tax case. I feel like the case should be in a coffin, and I feel like you just keep putting locks on it, where this thing should be just as dead as anything dead could be. But you never know what a court's going to do, so we'll have to wait and see. Jason Mercier, thanks so much for all your time.
Thanks, Dave.
You bet. And thank all of you for watching this latest episode of Washington Policy on the Go. We come back to you in 2 weeks, and we hope you'll join us then, and maybe invite a friend or a family member to watch the show and participate as well. Thanks for all your questions, and thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go to washingtonpolicy.org for the latest policy news every day on the Washington Policy blog. Thank you.